I stood in the rain outside my son's luxury condo building, watching him pull up in a car that cost more than I earned in 2 years of hard labor. The valet rushed to open his door while Brandon tossed the keys without even looking at the kid. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby, I could see marble floors so polished they looked like ice, and a doorman in a uniform nicer than anything hanging in my closet. My truck sat at a meter down the street, rust spreading along the wheel wells, the check engine light glowing like a constant reminder of everything I couldn't afford to fix. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 20 minutes ago, my son had looked me in the eye over $100 steak and told me I could never understand his lifestyle, that my little allowance barely covered his wine budget. What he didn't know was that little allowance represented a quarter of my monthly income, money I'd been scraping together by skipping medications and eating soup for dinner. What he also didn't know was that I had Eleanor's life insurance papers in my truck, and I'd just made a decision that was going to change both our lives forever. The morning started ordinary enough, the kind of gray October Saturday that makes Portland look like it's trapped under a wet blanket. I was in my workshop trying to fix a wobbly chair that belonged to Eleanor, one of those projects I kept putting off because finishing it meant accepting she wouldn't be here to sit in it. The wood grain reminded me of her hands, the way she'd run her fingers along the armrests while reading her mystery novels. 8 months gone and I still found her bookmarks in random places, her handwriting on shopping lists stuck to the refrigerator with magnets from places we'd visited. My phone buzzed against the workbench, scattering sawdust. Brandon's name lit up the screen. We hadn't spoken in maybe 6 weeks, not since Eleanor's birthday when I'd driven out to Lake Oswego for what Jessica called a small family dinner. Turned out small meant catered food for 30 people, most of whom I'd never met, all of them talking about vacation homes and stock portfolios while I sat in a corner wondering if anyone would notice if I left. The text was brief, typical Brandon style. Lunch today? Riverside Bistro at noon. My treat. Need to talk about something important. My treat. Those words should have been a red flag right there, but I was still operating under the assumption that my son had some shred of the values Eleanor and I had tried to instill in him. I texted back a simple yes and spent the next 2 hours trying to make myself presentable. My good shirt had a small stain near the collar that wouldn't come out, and my dress shoes were the same ones I'd worn to Eleanor's funeral, scuffed and worn but polished as best I could manage. The drive into downtown Portland took 40 minutes through drizzle that made the streets shine like black mirrors. I passed through Gresham where houses looked like mine, modest and tired, then watched as the neighborhood shifted into something else entirely. Bigger homes, newer cars, trees that seemed taller and healthier, like even the vegetation knew it was living in a better zip code. By the time I reached the Pearl District, everything gleamed with money and purpose. Riverside Bistro sat on the waterfront with a view of the Willamette River that probably justified the prices on its menu. I'd never eaten there before, never had occasion to spend $50 on a single meal when I could feed myself for a week on that amount. The hostess looked at my worn jacket and scuffed shoes with barely concealed doubt when I said I was meeting someone, but her expression changed when I mentioned Brandon's name. Apparently my son was a regular here. She led me through a dining room where everyone seemed to speak in hushed tones, where the silverware probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Brandon sat at a corner table with a view of the river, scrolling through his phone. He was wearing what I'd learned to recognize as expensive casual, a sweater that probably cost $300 made to look like it cost $30. His watch caught the light, something sleek and European that Richard had given him for his birthday. He looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, you made it. I was worried you'd get lost finding parking." I slid into the chair across from him, feeling the cushion give way in a manner that suggested quality I'd never experienced in furniture. "Found it just fine. How are you doing?" Brandon launched into an update about his life that sounded more like a travel brochure than a conversation. He'd just gotten back from Cabo, was thinking about Aspen for Christmas, had discovered this amazing new restaurant in the West Hills that did a tasting menu for only $200 per person. He talked about these things the way someone might discuss grocery shopping, like spending more on a single meal than I spent on food in a month was just normal life. The waiter appeared with menus bound in leather and pages that listed prices requiring mental math I didn't want to perform. Brandon ordered a bottle of wine without looking at the price, something French that the waiter praised with the enthusiasm of a man earning commission. When it arrived, Brandon made a show of tasting it, swirling and sniffing like he'd been trained by sommeliers instead of just watching too many movies. The lunch stretched on with me ordering the cheapest thing I could find, a sandwich that still cost $28, while Brandon got a steak that required its own description from the waiter about the farm it came from and the life the cow had lived. I watched him cut into meat that cost $65 and tried to remember when my son had become someone I didn't recognize. We made small talk about Jessica and Richard, about Sophie finishing her degree at Oregon State. Brandon spoke about his sister with casual dismissal, calling her degree in social work cute, like dedicating your life to helping people was some kind of hobby instead of a calling. He mentioned that Sophie was still driving that embarrassing Honda, still working 2 part-time jobs to cover what her scholarships didn't pay for. Unlike some people, she actually works for her money, I said, the words coming out sharper than intended. Brandon paused mid-bite, his fork hovering. What's that supposed to mean? Just an observation. Your sister works hard. He set down his fork with deliberate care. Dad, we've talked about this. Different people have different paths. Not everyone needs to struggle to prove their worth. Some of us are fortunate enough to focus on other things. Other things like what? I kept my voice level, but something cold was settling in my chest. Like networking, building connections, positioning myself for opportunities. Brandon leaned back, wine glass in hand. You can't understand because you came from a different generation. The economy works differently now. It's not about physical labor anymore, it's about leveraging resources and relationships. I thought about my hands, scarred and calloused from 35 years of construction work. I thought about Eleanor grading papers at the kitchen table late into the night, about the pride we'd taken in honest work honestly done. Resources and relationships. My son was 28 years old and had never held a job longer than 3 months, had never finished anything he'd started, had never known what it meant to wonder if you could afford both groceries and electricity in the same week. Speaking of resources, Brandon continued, reaching for his wine, I wanted to talk to you about something. I'm planning to start a business venture with some friends. Nothing concrete yet, still in the planning stages, but it's going to require some capital. The cold feeling in my chest spread outward. What kind of venture? He waved his hand dismissively. Tech startup, very cutting edge. We're looking at apps and platforms, disrupting traditional markets. The specifics are still being worked out, but the potential is enormous. And you need money for this. Just seed money to get started. I was thinking maybe you could increase the monthly amount you send me. Instead of $1,500, maybe make it $3,000. Just temporarily, until the business gets rolling. I set down my water glass carefully, afraid I might break it otherwise. Brandon, I can't afford to send you $3,000 a month. He laughed, actually laughed. Dad, come on. I know you got Eleanor's life insurance. You're sitting on a decent chunk of money. $3,000 is nothing. The world seemed to tilt slightly. You think your mother's life insurance is nothing? That's not what I meant. Brandon's tone shifted to something patronizing, like he was explaining simple concepts to a child. I just mean you have resources now. You could help me out with this opportunity. Think of it as an investment in your son's future. I've been investing in your future since you were born. The words came out quiet, dangerous. Your mother and I worked ourselves to exhaustion to give you and Sophie opportunities. We paid for your college, bought your first car, covered your expenses for years after graduation. And I appreciate that, but this is different. This is about building real wealth, not just scraping by. Brandon leaned forward, eyes bright with enthusiasm or maybe just reflected wine. You've always lived small, Dad. Small house, small dreams, small life. Don't you want more than that? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Small life. Eleanor teaching kids to read. Me building homes people would raise families in. Small dreams like saving enough to take your mother to the coast once a year, like putting 2 kids through college, like 30 years of marriage built on love and respect. Small. I think your mother and I did just fine, I said. Sure, for your generation. But times have changed. You could never afford my lifestyle, and that's okay. We just operate in different worlds now. Brandon signaled the waiter for the check. That's why I need you to understand this investment opportunity. It's a chance for me to really make something of myself. The waiter brought the check in a leather folder. Brandon glanced at it and casually handed over a credit card without looking at the total. $147 for a lunch that took 90 minutes. I did the math automatically. That was half my weekly grocery budget. That was 4 tanks of gas. That was the copay for 6 months of my blood pressure medication. Brandon signed the receipt with a flourish, adding a generous tip that was more than I'd spend on dinner for a week. The card, I noticed, had Richard's company name embossed on it. My son hadn't even paid for this lunch he'd invited me to. His stepfather had. We walked out into drizzle that had turned into proper rain. Brandon pulled out his phone to summon his car from wherever the valet had parked it. I stood there in my inadequate jacket, rain soaking into shoulders that suddenly felt very old and very tired. So what do you think about the investment? Brandon asked, barely looking up from his phone. Can I count on the extra monthly support? That's when I made my decision. Standing in the rain outside a restaurant I could never afford, watching my son treat money like air, watching him live off his dead mother's memory and his living father's sacrifice without a trace of gratitude or awareness. I thought about Eleanor and what she would say. I thought about Sophie working 2 jobs while finishing school. I thought about values and what happens when you shield people from consequences their whole lives. No, I said simply. Brandon looked up, confused. No to what? No to the investment. No to increasing the allowance. I took a breath, felt something shift inside me. No to any allowance at all. I'm cutting you off, Brandon. Effective immediately. His face went through several expressions, landing on incredulous. You're joking. I've never been more serious in my life. The valet pulled up with Brandon's BMW, and suddenly I knew exactly where this conversation needed to continue. I followed Brandon's BMW through the rain-slicked streets of downtown Portland, my old truck struggling to keep up as he wove through traffic with the casual aggression of someone who'd never worried about insurance deductibles or repair costs. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm that matched my pulse, each swipe clearing the glass only for rain to obscure it again. Traffic lights blurred into watercolor smears of red and green. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough that my knuckles went white, not from the driving conditions but from the conversation still echoing in my head. You could never afford my lifestyle. The words sat in my gut like spoiled food, making me nauseous with their casual cruelty. Brandon pulled into the underground parking garage of his building, flashing a key fob that raised a gleaming metal gate. I parked on the street at a meter that wanted $2 an hour, feeding it quarters from the cup holder where I kept change for exactly these situations. The rain had intensified, turning the sidewalk into a river that rushed towards storm drains clogged with fallen leaves. I didn't have an umbrella, hadn't owned one since Eleanor died because she was always the one who remembered things like that. By the time I reached the lobby entrance, my shirt was plastered to my back and water dripped from my hair into my eyes. The doorman intercepted me before I made it 3 steps inside. Sir, can I help you with something? His tone was professionally polite but his body language screamed security threat. I didn't blame him. I looked like exactly what I was, a working-class man in cheap clothes dripping water onto Italian marble that probably cost more per square foot than my monthly mortgage payment. I'm here to see my son, Brandon Harrison. 22nd floor. The doorman's expression shifted slightly, recognition mingling with confusion. He picked up a phone, spoke quietly into it, then nodded. "Mr. Harrison says to send you up. Elevators are to your left." The elevator was the kind with mirrors on all sides, forcing me to see myself from every angle as it climbed. An old man with gray hair thinning on top, deep lines around tired eyes, wearing a jacket with frayed cuffs and shoes that had been resoled twice. I looked every one of my 70 years and then some. The reflection showing me wasn't the strong young man who'd carried Eleanor over the threshold of our first apartment, who'd worked double shifts to save for a down payment, who'd built a life through sweat and determination. This was what was left after decades of hard work and modest living, after losing the person who made it all worthwhile. The elevator opened directly into Brandon's condo, one of those luxury setups where the entire floor belonged to a single unit. I stepped out onto hardwood floors so perfectly finished they looked like glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Portland spread out below, the river winding through the city like a gray ribbon, bridges spanning it at regular intervals. On a clear day this view probably stopped people in their tracks. Today it just looked cold and distant. Brandon stood in his open-concept kitchen, pouring himself a drink from a crystal decanter. "Want one?" "Scotch from Islay, costs about $300 a bottle." His tone suggested he was offering me a gift, sharing something precious from his world with someone from mine. "No thanks." I stayed near the elevator, not wanting to track water further into his pristine space. He shrugged and took a sip, making an appreciative sound. "Suit yourself." "So what was that dramatic scene outside the restaurant about? You trying to teach me some kind of lesson?" "Not trying to teach you anything. Just telling you how things are going to be from now on." Brandon laughed, setting his glass down on a counter that gleamed like it had never seen actual use. "Dad, you're upset. I get it. Maybe I came on too strong about the investment opportunity. We can talk about smaller amounts if 1,500 extra is too much." "You're not hearing me." I took a step forward, water squelching in my shoes. "There is no amount. No more allowance, no more monthly deposits, no more financial support of any kind." His smile faded slowly, like ice melting. "You can't be serious." I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app with fingers that shook slightly, and showed him the screen. "See that automatic transfer scheduled for the first of every month? $1,500 to your account?" I deleted it while standing there, watching his face as the scheduled payment disappeared. "Done." Brandon's expression cycled through disbelief to annoyance to something approaching actual emotion. "What am I supposed to do? You know I have expenses. Get a job." The words felt both liberating and terrifying. "Support yourself like everyone else has to." "A job?" He said it like I'd suggested he grow wings and fly to the moon. "Dad, I've been networking, building connections. You can't just throw all that away to flip burgers or stock shelves. Your sister works 2 jobs while finishing her degree. She manages somehow. Sophie's different. She's always been the responsible one, the good little worker bee." Brandon grabbed his drink again, took a longer pull this time. "I have potential for something bigger. I just need time to develop it. You've had 28 years to develop it." I looked around the condo, taking in the leather furniture and the abstract art on the walls, the kitchen full of appliances that looked like they'd never been touched, the open laptop on the coffee table showing what appeared to be a video game paused mid-action. "This place costs what, $4,000 or $5,000 a month?" $4,800, plus utilities. "And who pays for it?" "The trust fund Mom and Richard set up covers most of my living expenses." "Most. Not all. Which is why you need my $1,500 every month." Brandon set his glass down hard enough that liquid sloshed over the rim. "You make it sound like I'm some kind of parasite. I didn't ask to be born into this family situation. Mom remarried money, that's not my fault. And that trust fund your mother set up," I said carefully, "was that from her own earnings as a teacher, or was that Richard's money?" He looked away, which was answer enough. "Your mother taught for 23 years, earned every dollar through work she believed in. When she married Richard, she had nothing but her savings and her pension. That trust fund is Richard's generosity, not your inheritance. What's the difference? It's still family money. The difference is that it's not your mother's legacy. It's your stepfather's charity. And you treat it like you're entitled to it, like you've earned it somehow. I have earned it. Brandon's voice rose, actual anger creeping in. Do you know how hard it is to be the stepson? Always feeling like I'm not quite good enough, not quite part of the real family. That money is the least they can do. I thought about Jessica, my daughter, and how she'd changed after marrying Richard. The way she'd slowly stopped visiting the old house in Gresham, stopped calling as often, started speaking in a different vocabulary about things I didn't understand. I thought about holidays at their Lake Oswego house where I felt like a museum piece. The working-class father trotted out to prove they hadn't forgotten their roots even though everything about their lives said otherwise. Your mother loves you, I said quietly. She always has. But love doesn't mean funding a lifestyle you haven't earned. So what, you're just going to abandon me? Let me lose everything? You're not going to lose everything. You're going to learn what things actually cost. You're going to discover whether those connections and networks you've been building are worth anything. You're going to find out who you are when nobody's handing you money. Brandon picked up his phone, fingers moving rapidly. We'll see what Mom has to say about this. I waited while he typed, sent the message, then stared at his screen waiting for a response. It came quickly, the phone buzzing in his hand. He read it, his face going through several expressions before settling on something like betrayal. She says she supports your decision. He looked up at me with genuine confusion. She says it's about time someone taught me responsibility. The rain hammered against the windows, 22 stories up where the sound was different, more insistent. I could see my reflection in the glass, ghostly and insubstantial against the city backdrop. Eleanor would have handled this better, would have found gentler words, a kinder approach. But Eleanor wasn't here, and I was doing the best I could with what I had left. There's something else you should know, I said. That life insurance money you mentioned, the decent chunk I'm supposedly sitting on. Half of it is going into a fund for Sophie, to help her get started after graduation. The other half is going to charity, organizations your mother cared about. Teachers' associations, literacy programs, things that mattered to her. You're giving away my inheritance. It was never your inheritance. It was your mother's life, her work, her values made tangible. And she would want it used to help people who need it, not to fund a lifestyle someone's too proud to earn. Brandon sank onto his expensive couch, the fight seeming to drain out of him. What am I supposed to do, Dad? I don't know how to live any other way. Then you're going to learn. I moved toward the elevator, ready to leave before I said something I'd regret or worse, before I gave in to the impulse to take it all back, to make things easier for him because that's what I'd always done. You're smart when you choose to be. You're capable when you try. Figure it out. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors slid shut, I saw Brandon still sitting there, drink in hand, staring at nothing in his perfect apartment that suddenly must have felt a lot less secure. The descent was faster than the climb, my stomach lurching as the elevator dropped. By the time I reached the lobby, I was shaking, adrenaline and fear and something that might have been relief all mixing together into a cocktail that left me lightheaded. The rain had eased to a drizzle by the time I reached my truck. I sat in the cab with the engine running, heater blasting, trying to process what I'd just done. My phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. Can you come to the house? We need to talk about this. Richard is furious. Of course Richard was furious. I'd just cut off the money flow to his stepson, disrupted the comfortable arrangement that let everyone pretend Brandon was doing fine. I texted back a simple response. Tomorrow. Too tired today. The drive back to Gresham took longer than the trip in, traffic building as people headed home for Saturday evening. I listened to the classic rock station Eleanor and I had always preferred, letting the familiar songs wash over me. The Doobie Brothers, Fleetwood Mac, the Eagles, music from a time when things seemed simpler even though they probably weren't. My neighborhood appeared through the gray afternoon, modest houses with chain-link fences and cars that had seen better days, lives lived without pretension or luxury but with dignity and purpose. Home looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I just felt smaller after standing in Brandon's palace in the sky. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, staring at the house Eleanor and I had bought 32 years ago, the house where we'd raised 2 children, celebrated holidays, weathered storms both literal and figurative. The garden she'd planted was overgrown now, vegetables I didn't have the heart to harvest rotting on the vine. Her car still sat in the garage, gathering dust because I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Inside, the emptiness felt heavier than usual. I made coffee I didn't want and sat at the kitchen table where Eleanor used to grade papers. Her reading glasses were still on the windowsill, next to a coffee mug that said "World's Best Teacher." I'd washed that mug 100 times since she died but never put it away, couldn't bear to file it in a cupboard where I wouldn't see it every day. My phone rang. Sophie's name on the screen, and I felt my chest tighten with something that might have been hope or might have been dread. "Grandpa?" Her voice was cautious, careful. "Mom called me. She told me what happened with Brandon. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. Don't apologize." Sophie's voice strengthened. "I'm proud of you. Someone needed to do this years ago." Sophie's words settled into my chest like warmth spreading through cold muscles. I leaned back in the kitchen chair, phone pressed to my ear, and felt some of the tension drain from my shoulders. "Your mother doesn't seem to think it's something to be proud of." "Mom's scared," Sophie said, and I could hear traffic in the background, the whoosh of cars passing wherever she was. "She's scared Richard will be angry, scared of what the neighbors will think, scared Brandon will actually have to face consequences. But that doesn't make you wrong. Richard called me irresponsible. Said I was sabotaging Brandon's future over some petty grudge. Richard's been enabling Brandon for 6 years, ever since he married Mom." Sophie's voice carried an edge I rarely heard from her, my gentle granddaughter who always tried to see the best in people. "He thinks money solves everything because for him it always has. But Brandon doesn't need more money, Grandpa. He needs to grow up." I stared at Eleanor's reading glasses on the windowsill, imagining what she'd say about all this. "Your grandmother would know how to handle this better than me. Grandma would have done exactly what you did, just with nicer words and probably some cookies involved." Sophie laughed softly. "Remember when Brandon got caught cheating on his college entrance exam and Grandma made him withdraw his applications and wait a year? Everyone thought she was being too harsh, but she said consequences were love in disguise." The memory hit me hard. Eleanor sitting Brandon down at this same kitchen table, her voice firm but kind, explaining that integrity mattered more than acceptance letters. Brandon had been furious, called her old-fashioned and out of touch. But he'd waited the year, retaken the test legitimately, gotten into a decent school on his own merit. That had been the last time anyone had really held him accountable for anything. "I should have stepped in sooner," I said. "After your grandmother died, I just didn't have the energy to fight. Easier to send the money and pretend everything was fine. You were grieving. You still are." Sophie's voice gentled. "But you're awake now, and that's what matters. Listen, I'm driving back to Corvallis but I'll be up next weekend. Can I come stay with you? We can go through Grandma's things, do that project we keep putting off." "I'd like that." The words came out rougher than intended, emotion catching in my throat. We talked for a few more minutes about her classes, her work-study job at the university library, her plans after graduation in the spring. Sophie wanted to work for a nonprofit, something focused on youth services or family support. The kind of work that paid terribly but mattered enormously, exactly the kind of choice Eleanor would have celebrated. When we hung up, the house felt less empty than it had in months. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical October weather that made everything look washed out and tired. I was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, trying to focus on words that kept blurring together, when headlights swept across the front window. A Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway, sleek and enormous, looking wildly out of place on my street where most vehicles were at least a decade old. Jessica climbed out of the passenger side, picking her way carefully across the wet driveway in shoes that were definitely not made for rain. Richard emerged from the driver's side, 6 feet tall in a cashmere coat that probably cost what I spent on groceries in 6 months. They stood on my porch, and I could see Jessica saying something to Richard, her hand on his arm in a gesture that looked like either reassurance or restraint. I opened the door before they could knock. Jessica looked like she'd been crying, mascara smudged under her eyes despite obvious attempts to fix it. Richard looked like a man barely containing his temper, jaw clenched tight and eyes hard. "Dad, we need to talk about yesterday." Jessica's voice wavered. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside, let them into the living room where furniture Eleanor and I had bought at estate sales and thrift stores suddenly looked even shabbier next to Richard's polished appearance. They sat on the couch, Jessica perched on the edge like she might need to run, Richard spreading out like he owned the place. "Frank, I'll get right to it." Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What you did yesterday was completely inappropriate. You had no right to cut off Brandon's support without discussing it with Jessica and me first. Brandon's my son, not yours." I stayed standing, didn't want to give Richard the high ground of looking down at me. And that money was mine to give or not give. That money was part of a family support system we'd established. Richard leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees in what probably looked like a reasonable posture in boardrooms. "Brandon has built his life around certain expectations. You can't just pull the rug out because you're having some kind of crisis." Crisis. I let the word hang there for a moment. Is that what we're calling it when someone expects their adult son to support himself? "Brandon is supporting himself," Jessica interjected. "The trust fund covers his basic expenses. Your allowance was just supplemental." "Supplemental for what?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, trying to find the girl who'd worked 3 jobs to help pay for college, who'd been so proud when she got her first teaching position, who'd once told me she wanted to make a difference the way her mother had. "What happened to you, Jessica?" She flinched like I'd slapped her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't recognize you anymore. You used to believe in hard work, in earning what you had. Now you're defending your son living in a luxury condo while his sister works herself to exhaustion just to get by." "Sophie chose that path," Richard said dismissively. "She could have accepted our help, could be living comfortably while focusing on her studies. She's stubborn, like her grandfather apparently. She's principled, like her grandmother definitely." The anger was building now, hot and focused. "And she'll be better for it. She'll know what she's capable of, know she earned everything she has. What does Brandon know except that someone will always catch him when he falls?" "This isn't about Sophie," Jessica said. "This is about you punishing Brandon for saying something that hurt your feelings. He said I could never afford his lifestyle." The words still stung, sharp and dismissive. "He said it like I should be ashamed, like the life your mother and I built was something small and pathetic." Jessica looked away, and I saw it then, the embarrassment she'd been hiding. She was ashamed, or at least uncomfortable with the contrast between her childhood home and the mansion she lived in now. Richard had given her a life of comfort and status, and somewhere along the way she'd started believing that made it better than what she'd come from. "Your mother taught school for 23 years, I said quietly. "She touched hundreds of lives, helped kids learn to read, to think, to imagine. I built homes where families made memories, solid structures that'll stand long after I'm gone. Maybe that's not worth much in your world, but it meant something in ours." "Dad," Richard stood, his patience clearly exhausted. "Let's cut through the emotional manipulation. Here's the reality. Brandon has opportunities lined up, connections that could lead to real success. But he needs stability while those opportunities develop. Your allowance provides that stability. Without it, he'll have to take some dead-end job just to survive, and all that potential will be wasted." "Good. Let it be wasted if it can't survive without constant propping up. If those connections and opportunities are real, they'll still be there after he's worked a few shifts and learned what it's like to earn money. If they disappear the moment he has to actually work, then they weren't worth having." Richard's face flushed red. "You're being deliberately obtuse. The modern economy doesn't work the way it did in your day. Success requires positioning, networking, being available when opportunities arise. You can't do that while working retail. Funny, I said, moving to the mantel where photos of Eleanor sat among pictures of the kids at various ages. Your stepson seems to have plenty of time for video games and expensive lunches and trips to Cabo. Seems like he could carve out 40 hours a week for a job if he really needed to. Those are investments in his network, in maintaining relationships that could pay off long-term. Or they're just entertainment dressed up in business language because nobody wants to admit he's a 28-year-old man with no work ethic and no real plans. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Jessica was crying openly now, quiet tears that tracked through her makeup. Richard stood rigid, clearly working to control his temper. I stayed by the mantel, one hand resting on a photo of Eleanor at the beach, wind whipping her hair, smile bright and genuine. I loved your mother very much, I said to Jessica. And she loved both you kids more than anything. But she would be heartbroken to see what Brandon's become. Not angry, not disappointed, heartbroken. Because she knew what he could be, what he should be, and watching him waste his potential would hurt her more than anything. That's not fair, Jessica whispered. You can't speak for her. I lived with her for 32 years. I think I know what she'd say. Richard made a disgusted sound. This is pointless. Frank, you're clearly not going to listen to reason. But understand this, when Brandon loses his apartment, when he's struggling, when this stubborn lesson of yours backfires, don't expect us to clean up your mess. It won't be my mess to clean up. It'll be Brandon's mess to figure out. That's the whole point. They left shortly after, Richard's Mercedes backing out of my driveway with more force than necessary, spraying gravel. I watched them go from the window, my reflection ghostly in the glass. The house settled into silence around me, and I realized my hands were shaking. The rest of Sunday passed in a fog. I tried to work on Eleanor's chair in the shop but couldn't focus, kept measuring wrong and having to start over. Finally gave up and went for a walk through the neighborhood, past houses where families were probably dealing with their own dramas and difficulties, their own versions of hard choices and uncertain outcomes. My phone rang intermittently throughout the day. Brandon called 3 times, but I let it go to voicemail. Couldn't face another conversation, another attempt at manipulation or guilt or anger. Tim Cooper, my neighbor and old friend from the fire department, texted to ask if I wanted to grab a beer. I declined, not ready to explain what was happening, what I'd done. Evening came early, the way it does in October when the days are shrinking toward winter. I made soup from a can and ate it while watching a baseball playoff game I didn't care about. The announcers' voices filled the emptiness, but their enthusiasm for something so trivial felt jarring against the weight sitting on my chest. Eleanor's voice kept echoing in my memory, things she'd said over the years about parenting and love and the hard work of letting people face their own consequences. She'd been better at this than me, better at holding the line while still showing compassion, better at knowing when to help and when to step back. I missed her with an intensity that hadn't dulled in 8 months, missed her wisdom and her strength and the way she could make hard things feel manageable. Monday morning I woke to my phone buzzing. A text from an unknown number. Mr. Harrison, this is David Chen, Brandon's landlord. Your son gave me your number as his emergency contact. His rent check bounced. Please call me to discuss payment arrangements. I stared at the message for a long time, coffee growing cold in my hand. This was it, the first real consequence, the moment when I could step in and fix things the way I always had. My finger hovered over the call button. One phone call, one payment, and I could smooth this over, give Brandon a little more time, ease him into responsibility gradually. Instead, I texted back. Brandon is an adult. Any arrangements need to be made directly with him. Then I blocked the number before I could change my mind. The following days blurred together in a haze of second-guessing and determination. Tuesday morning brought another call from a number I didn't recognize, this time a collection agency asking about a credit card in Brandon's name that listed me as a reference. I explained I wasn't responsible for his debts and hung up feeling sick to my stomach. Wednesday, Jessica left a voicemail saying Brandon had moved back in with them temporarily, that Richard was furious and they needed space to figure things out. Her voice sounded thin and strained, like a wire pulled too tight. Thursday I drove to the hardware store, needing something to do with my hands, some project to focus on besides the wreckage I'd potentially caused. Mr. Chen, who owned the place, had known Eleanor and me for 20 years, always gave me a contractor's discount even though I'd been retired for a decade. He was restocking paint when I walked in, his weathered face breaking into a smile that faded when he got a good look at me. "Frank, you look like hell. What's going on?" I found myself telling him everything while we stood in the paint aisle, the chemical smell sharp in my nostrils. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his expression neutral. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, studying a can of primer like it held answers. "My son's 45, he said finally. "Took over the business 5 years ago. You know what I did before I gave him the keys? Made him work every job in this place. Stocking, register, customer service, inventory, janitorial. 2 years of starting at the bottom even though he had a business degree and knew he'd inherit everything eventually. Did he resent it? Oh, he hated me for about 6 months. Mr. Chen smiled, but it was sad around the edges. Called me old-fashioned, said I didn't understand modern business practices. His college friends were getting management positions right out of school and here he was mopping floors. But you know what? Now he knows this business from foundation to roof. Respects the work, respects the people who do it. And when suppliers or customers try to take advantage, he knows exactly what things should cost and how long they should take because he's done it himself. Think I did the right thing?" Mr. Chen shrugged, going back to his stocking. "I think you did the only thing. Sometimes love looks like a locked door. Doesn't feel like love at the time, but that doesn't make it less true. I bought supplies for a project I didn't need, just to have something to carry, some purpose to justify leaving the house. The drive home took me past Brandon's condo building, and I found myself slowing down, looking up at the 22nd floor where lights glowed in the gray afternoon. Was he up there packing? Had they already evicted him? Or was Richard quietly paying the rent while Jessica tried to negotiate some compromise that would let everyone save face? Friday brought rain that matched my mood, heavy and relentless. I was in the garage attempting to fix Eleanor's chair when Sophie's Honda pulled into the driveway, earlier than expected for her weekend visit. She emerged with an umbrella and a duffel bag, picking her way around puddles to where I stood in the open garage. "Finished my last midterm early," she said by way of greeting. "Thought you might need company." We worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Sophie sanding the chair legs smooth while I measured and cut new support braces. The repetitive physical work was soothing, the smell of wood and varnish familiar and grounding. Rain drummed on the garage roof, and for a little while it was possible to pretend the world consisted only of this small space, this simple task, this quiet companionship. "Mom called me," Sophie said eventually. "She wants me to talk to you, convince you to reconsider." "What did you tell her?" "That I wasn't getting in the middle of it." Sophie examined her work critically, ran her thumb along the wood grain. "But I did talk to Brandon." I looked up from my measuring. "How is he?" "Scared, mostly. His lease is up for renewal at the end of the month and he can't afford it. Richard offered to cover it if Brandon agreed to certain conditions, but Brandon's too proud to accept." "What kind of conditions?" "Weekly therapy sessions, job applications, detailed budgeting with oversight. Basically treating him like he's 16 again." Sophie set down her sandpaper and looked at me directly. "Richard means well, I think, but he's approaching it like a business problem instead of a family issue." "And your mother?" "Caught in the middle like always. She wants to help Brandon but knows you're right. Wants to support Richard but resents him taking over. Wants everyone to be happy but doesn't know how to make that happen." Sophie's voice carried a weariness that seemed too heavy for 22. "Sometimes I think she traded one kind of hard for another when she married Richard." We finished the chair as afternoon faded toward evening, the wood smooth and solid under our hands. It would need staining and a new cushion for the seat, but the structure was sound again, capable of holding weight. Eleanor would have been pleased with the work, I thought. She always said broken things deserved another chance at being useful. Sophie made spaghetti for dinner, the kitchen filling with the smell of garlic and tomato sauce. We ate at the table where Eleanor used to sit, talking about Sophie's thesis on family systems and trauma, her plans for after graduation. She wanted to work with at-risk youth, kids caught between impossible choices and inadequate support systems. The kind of work that required emotional reserves I wasn't sure I had anymore, but that Sophie seemed built for. "You're more like your grandmother than you know," I said as we cleared dishes. Sophie smiled, but it was complicated. "Grandma had you, though. Someone to balance her out, to be the practical one while she saved the world. I'm still figuring out how to be both." The doorbell rang at 8:30, unexpected enough that we both froze. Through the front window I could see Brandon's BMW parked at the curb, rain beating on its sleek surface. My grandson stood on the porch looking diminished somehow, his expensive clothes hanging on him wrong, his face gray in the porch light. I opened the door. Sophie hovered in the hallway behind me, uncertain whether to stay or give us privacy. "Grandpa, can we talk?" Brandon's voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying or shouting or both. "Come in. You're getting soaked." He stepped inside, tracking water on the old carpet, and stood dripping in the entryway like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Sophie moved past us into the kitchen, giving us space but staying close enough to intervene if needed. "I got evicted," Brandon said without preamble. "Well, not officially evicted. The landlord agreed not to pursue it if I moved out by Sunday. Richard offered to pay everything, smooth it all over, but the conditions he wanted, I just couldn't." "What did he want?" Brandon laughed, bitter and sharp. "A job within 2 weeks. Weekly therapy. Access to my bank accounts to review all spending. Basically complete control of my life. He said it was for my own good, that I clearly couldn't manage myself." "Can you?" The question came out gentler than I intended. "Manage yourself, I mean." He was silent for a long moment, water dripping from his jacket onto the floor. "I don't know. I've never had to." The honesty of it cut deeper than any argument could have. Here was my grandson, 28 years old, genuinely uncertain if he could function as an independent adult. How had we let it get this far? How had love and support twisted into something that left him this unprepared for basic existence? "Where are you staying?" I asked. "I've been in a motel the last 2 nights. The kind with hourly rates and sketchy people in the parking lot." Brandon looked around the small living room, at the worn furniture and dated wallpaper. "This house seemed so shabby to me before. Now it looks like the safest place in the world." "You can stay here," I heard myself say. "Sophie's in the guest room this weekend, but there's an air mattress in the basement. It's dry and warm, better than a motel." "Really?" The hope in his face was painful to see. "After everything I said, everything I've done, you'd still help me?" "This isn't help, it's temporary shelter." "Big difference." I stepped back to let him come fully inside. "You can stay for 2 weeks, maybe 3 while you figure things out. But there are conditions, and they're not negotiable." Brandon nodded quickly, eager. "Anything. I'll do whatever you need. First, you get a job. Any job. I don't care if it's retail or food service or janitorial work. Something that pays and gets you out of this house 40 hours a week. Second, you pay rent. Not much, maybe $300 a month, but something that represents a real contribution. Third, you help around here. Cooking, cleaning, yard work, whatever needs doing. And fourth, you save money. Half of everything you earn goes into savings until you have enough for first and last month's rent somewhere you can actually afford." Brandon swallowed hard. "What if I can't find work right away?" "Then you have 2 weeks to try before you need to find somewhere else to stay." I kept my voice firm, fighting the urge to soften the terms. "I'm not doing this to punish you, Brandon. I'm doing it because I love you enough to want you to become the person you're capable of being." He nodded again, something shifting in his expression. Can I bring my stuff in? It's all in the car. We spent the next hour carrying boxes and suitcases from his BMW, a ridiculous amount of possessions that barely fit in the basement. Designer clothes and expensive electronics, watches that cost more than my truck, shoes that probably required special care. The detritus of a lifestyle that was ending whether Brandon accepted it or not. Sophie made hot chocolate while we set up the air mattress and found clean sheets. The basement wasn't fancy, just concrete floors and exposed beams, but it was dry and the old furnace kept it warm enough. Brandon sat on the air mattress looking lost, holding a mug of cocoa like he wasn't sure what to do with it. Thank you, he said quietly. I know I don't deserve this. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. I settled onto an old lawn chair we kept down there. Your grandmother believed that people could change if they wanted to badly enough. I'm choosing to believe it too. What if I fail? What if I can't hack it, can't find work or can't keep it? Then you fail and you learn from it and you try again. That's what most people do. Sophie appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her own mug cradled in her hands. The only real failure is not trying at all. We talked for another hour, the three of us in that unfinished basement, rain still falling outside. Brandon asked questions about job applications and interviews, clearly nervous about a process he'd never been through. Sophie shared stories from her own work experiences, the difficult customers and demanding bosses, the small victories and hard lessons. I mostly listened, watching my grandchildren connect in a way they hadn't in years, the gap between their lives temporarily bridged by shared uncertainty and cautious hope. When we finally went upstairs, Brandon stayed in the basement arranging his things. I could hear him moving around, opening and closing boxes, the sound of someone trying to make a temporary space feel less temporary. Sophie and I stood in the kitchen, and she put her hand on my arm. That was good, what you did. Letting him stay but with boundaries. Hope I'm doing the right thing. Grandma would say there is no right thing, only the loving thing. And sometimes the loving thing is hard. I thought about Eleanor, about how she would have handled this situation with more grace than I could muster. But she wasn't here, and I was doing the best I could with the tools I had. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, washing the streets clean, preparing the ground for whatever came next. 6 months transformed everything in ways I couldn't have predicted that rainy October evening when Brandon moved into my basement. Spring arrived early in Portland, cherry blossoms exploding into pink clouds along the streets, the kind of beauty that made Eleanor's absence feel both sharper and somehow more bearable. I stood in the backyard watching Sophie and Brandon work together in the garden plot we'd cleared, their hands dark with soil as they planted vegetables according to the meticulous plan Eleanor had sketched years ago but never completed. Brandon straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His clothes were old jeans and a faded t-shirt, both stained with honest dirt. The expensive watch was gone, sold 3 months back to help cover the security deposit on his new apartment. He looked leaner now, harder somehow, like life had filed away the soft edges and revealed something more substantial underneath. Think Grandma would approve of our rows? He asked, surveying the neat lines of turned earth. She'd say they're crooked but give you credit for trying. I handed him a bottle of water from the cooler. She always believed effort mattered more than perfection. Sophie laughed, pushing hair from her face. Remember when I tried to make her a birthday cake and used salt instead of sugar? She ate a whole piece and said it was interesting, very creative. The memory settled warm in my chest. Brandon had been 12 then, had told his sister the truth about the cake because he thought honesty was more important than kindness. Eleanor had taken him aside later and explained that sometimes love meant letting people keep their dignity, even if it meant eating terrible cake. He'd been too young to understand it then. I learned something like that at work yesterday, Brandon said, reaching for the seed packets. This customer was returning a drill that was clearly broken from misuse, not defective. My manager told me to process the return anyway, said keeping the customer happy was worth more than being right. He'd been working at Chen's Hardware for 5 months now, had started stocking shelves and worked his way up to the customer service counter. Mr. Chen told me last week that Brandon was the most reliable employee he'd had in years, always early, never complained, treated every task like it mattered. The pride in his voice had made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, like maybe I'd done something right after all. That's wisdom Eleanor would have appreciated, I said. She used to tell her students that being kind was more important than being smart. We worked until the afternoon sun suggested dinner, then moved inside where the kitchen smelled like the roast Sophie had started in the slow cooker that morning. Jessica and Richard were coming for Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition we'd established after months of careful rebuilding. The first few dinners had been awkward, everyone walking on eggshells around topics that might explode into conflict. But time and consistency had smoothed some of the rough edges, created space for something that felt almost like family again. They arrived precisely at 5, Richard carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than I wanted to know. But he'd stopped making comments about my house or my neighborhood, and Jessica no longer looked embarrassed to be here. Small victories, Eleanor would have called them. The kind that mattered most. Dinner conversation flowed easier than it once had. Richard asked Brandon about work, actually listened to the answer instead of offering unsolicited advice. Jessica talked about returning to teaching part-time, how strange and wonderful it felt to be back in a classroom after 6 years away. Sophie shared news about her job offer from a youth services organization, good pay and better benefits, starting in June after graduation. I'm moving to Seattle, she announced, watching our faces. The position is perfect for what I want to do, working with teens in crisis. It's scary but it feels right. Eleanor would be so proud, Jessica said, and her voice cracked slightly. Both of you, building lives that matter. After dinner, Richard asked to see the garden. I walked him out back, suspicious of his motives but willing to try. We stood looking at the neat rows, the small plants just beginning to emerge from soil still cool from winter. I owe you an apology, Richard said without preamble. Last fall I thought you were being cruel to Brandon. I see now you were being kind in a way I didn't understand. You were trying to help in your own way. My way would have kept him dependent forever. Richard's hands were in his pockets, his expensive shoes muddy from the damp grass. I thought providing everything he needed was love. Turns out it was just easier than dealing with the hard stuff. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who'd approached the same problem from opposite directions and somehow ended up in the same place. He's going to be okay, Richard said. Your grandson. He's got something now he didn't have before. What's that? Self-respect. Richard turned to look at me. That's something no amount of money can buy. Inside, Brandon was showing Jessica photos on his phone of the apartment he'd found, a studio in Gresham not far from my house. It wasn't fancy, he was saying, but it was his. He'd saved enough for the deposit and first 3 months of rent, had furniture from thrift stores and dishes from the dollar store. Jessica was crying quietly, and I knew she was seeing what I saw, the boy she'd raised becoming the man he was meant to be. Later, after Richard and Jessica left, after Sophie went upstairs to pack for her drive back to Corvallis, Brandon and I sat on the back porch watching the sun set behind the neighbors' roofs. The air smelled like growing things and possibility. I signed up for community college classes, he said. Starting in fall. Business management, but also some liberal arts stuff. Philosophy, literature. Things I should have learned the first time around. Your grandmother loved literature. Used to say stories taught us how to be human. Maybe I'll finally figure that out. Brandon smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way it hadn't in years. Thank you for not giving up on me, Grandpa. For caring enough to let me fail. You didn't fail. You learned. Big difference. We sat until the stars came out, faint against the city's light pollution but visible if you knew where to look. I thought about Eleanor and how she would have loved this moment, this evidence that hard choices could lead to good outcomes, that love sometimes looked like locked doors and empty bank accounts. The house behind us glowed warm, full of people finding their way back to each other, to themselves. Tomorrow Brandon would go to work at the hardware store, would help customers and stock shelves and earn money that meant something because he'd worked for it. Sophie would drive back to finish her last month of college, would graduate into a career of service and meaning. Jessica would stand in front of a classroom again, would remember who she'd been before wealth complicated everything. And I would tend Eleanor's garden, would watch things grow from seeds planted in faith that spring always follows winter. The evening air carried a chill that suggested jacket weather, but neither of us moved to go inside. Some moments were worth being cold for, worth holding on to just a little longer. Family wasn't about money or status or perfect lives and perfect houses. It was about showing up, doing hard things, believing people could change if given the space and support and necessary struggles to become who they were meant to be. Brandon's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled. Job interview next week. Assistant manager position at another hardware store across town. Better pay, real opportunities for advancement. You'll do great. Hope so. Either way, I'll figure it out. And he would. We both knew it now. The scared kid who'd sat in a luxury condo 6 months ago couldn't see past his own fear and entitlement. This version, weathered and wiser, understood that figuring it out was exactly the point. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.